Sorry if you can hear a toddler screaming in the background. The joy of Zoom, working from home. Okay. So once again, thanks for being here today. We're really excited about this nonprofit listening session that we have. With us today is Blaine Harding. He is the Director of Diversity and Engagement and the Officer for Inclusion and Diversity at Virginia Tech. And we're really excited that he's joining us to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and how we can take some of that work and apply it in the nonprofit space. And so I'm going to let him take over in just a few minutes. But before I do so, just a few tips and tricks as we're all on Zoom. We've been doing this for a year now, so I'm sure we're all familiar with these. But if you're not speaking, please mute your mic. And we do have the chat feature available. So if you do have questions for the speaker, we're going to wait until the end to ask those. But you can go ahead and put those in the chat box if you would like to do so. So I'm going to now stop sharing my screen, and Blaine, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to all of you. You might not know this, but I'm in Reno, Nevada, and it's 5 o'clock in the morning. But I'm an early riser, so that shouldn't bother me at all. Lisa Garcia, I believe her name was, saw me do a presentation for the Distinguished Speaker Series for Mechanical Engineering, and she couldn't be here, so I'm a very poor substitute. And my topic is going to be a little different. I'm going to talk about cultural competency and cultural humility. Very oftentimes we only talk about the competency, but we always forget about the humility. And we really have to have both of those, and we have to have a solid understanding of what both of those mean and what both of those can do. So before I pull up the PowerPoint, I just want to say a couple things I think are really important when you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think the number one thing that you have to understand in anybody that's trying to become culturally competent or culturally effective, however you want to define that, needs to understand that you have to treat the individual within a cultural context. That is the utmost important thing, because not everybody identifies with how they look. And sometimes you make assumptions about that on a regular basis. We always want to know, what are you and what's your background and what's your ethnicity and, so forth and so on. But you've got to treat that individual within a cultural context. And you get to know the individual and build a relationship with the individual, and then you can talk about culture. Because when it comes right down to it, and I'm a strong believer in this, even though I know a lot of folks aren't, it's really not about culture. It's about lived experiences. And those are two very different things, because you can take a look at African-American culture, you can take a look at third, fourth, fifth generation Latino culture, and it's really not that much different from the dominant culture that we all live in. So it's really about people's lived experiences, and those lived experiences vary. I'm from upstate New York, and I'm in Southwest Virginia now, and it was culture shock for a few months. I had to get adjusted. I had to make sure I understood, what was going on. Certain things and the way I used to say them, I can't say them anymore. And if you've ever been to the Northeast, I think you understand what I'm saying. But it's about treating that individual within the cultural context, and that's extremely, extremely important. 4 things that we always have to remember. The first one is respect, and that's the most important one. And everybody's sung or have heard Aretha Franklin's R-E-S-P-E-C-T. So we won't sing that this morning. It's a bit early, but that's really important. That is vital, that aspect of respect, treating people with dignity. And you have to treat people with dignity, just like they have to treat you with dignity. And we always talk about the golden rule, that we're going to treat people the way we want to be treated. That's not my rule. My rule is different. You treat people the way they want to be treated. Not everybody wants to be treated the same, and that's really treating them as individuals. I was doing a presentation on campus last semester, and I said that to a student, and I said, how old are you? He said, 18. I said, I don't want to be treated like an 18-year-old. And he looked at me and he said, that's good, because I don't want to be treated like a 64-year-old. So he understood exactly where I was coming from, but you have to make sure that you're treating people with dignity, and then it's compassion and empathy. Those are the 4 most important things that you have to understand. Respect, dignity, compassion, and empathy. So I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint. How long do I have, Ashley?
We have until 9 o'clock. So if you want to save some room at the end for questions about 8:50.
Okay, that sounds great. So let me just pull this up. All right. It's been a year and I'm still getting used to Zoom. Can everybody see that? So as I said, we're going to talk about cultural humility and really becoming a culturally humble professional. And you can substitute any word there. I mean, this is really important, not only for your profession, not only for getting along with the folks around you and the folks that you're serving, it's also important within your communities. It's also important within other organizations that you might be part of. So competency versus humility. The whole concept of humility came out of public health and social work. And they're relatively new. One of them was 1998. And for some people, that's not new, but I think that's relatively new for a theory to actually be put in place. And we always talk about the idea of competency, but you have to have both of these. So I'm not saying that competency is more important than humility, or humility is more important than competency. We have to have both of those in order to be effective. One of them is external, and that's cultural competency. It's always about the other and getting to know the other and making sure that the language that you're using is very appropriate. But cultural humility is about yourself. Cultural humility is about how you handle your situation. It's about how much you know about yourself and how you identify. And very oftentimes when we do this type of work, we don't even ask ourselves how we identify. You know, I went around campus in the classes I was lecturing in last semester and asked students, how do you identify? And they never even thought about that question, because they're always worried about the person that's in front of them. They're always concentrating on that. The most important part of what's on the screen right now is in blue. You have to reflect and address on our own biases. And all of us have biases. You cannot become culturally competent and cultural humility unless you actually understand what your biases are. And part of the situation with biases is the people are embarrassed sometimes. They're ashamed that they have them. They think that they're hiding their prejudice and so forth and so on. But most of the biases are unconscious. And we have to understand that they come in three different ways. They come in emotional bias, cognitive bias, and behavioral. You know, you take a look at the prejudice, which is the thought, the stereotypes, which is the thought, and the discrimination, which becomes the action. So we want to make sure that we understand those biases, because they get in the way of building those strong relationships. So very oftentimes they get in the way of us being comfortable within those. And we have to get to the point where we're comfortable being uncomfortable. And we have to understand that, because if you're not uncomfortable to a certain point, then you're probably not learning. You're probably not sharing, and you're probably not being genuine and open, because you're hiding things from folks. So these are things that we don't have to verbally say to the people in front of us. We just have to understand what they are. And we have to understand what they are in order to move forward. So the real key is not feeling guilty, because once you feel guilty, then people just shut down. You know, I've had biases in my life that I never even thought I had. And I always tell this story, and it's kind of an embarrassing story, but I was the director of academic advising, recruitment, and retention at Colorado State towards the end of my career there. And I have a lesbian sister, a lesbian daughter, and a lesbian aunt. So I thought I was extremely open to the LGBTQ community. So my administrative assistant that had been working with me 15 years pulled me aside. And she said, Blaine, do you realize that when you have a self-identified gay student, that your meetings last 10 to 15 minutes? But when any other student comes in, you're in there for an hour, you're joking and laughing and having a good time. And I didn't even realize that I was uncomfortable until it was pointed out to me. And we have to make sure that we're open enough so that we can also point out other biases that we have. And then we have to check them so they don't get in the way of our values. So biases are really the first key to actually becoming culturally competent and for demonstrating cultural humility. Okay. So when you when you get rid of these biases, we're not going to get rid of all of them. And I know at many universities across the country now, people have to take unconscious bias training to be on search committees and so forth. And anybody that does that as a professional or does that for their living will tell you that those biases will come back if you're not constantly checking them. So you have to understand, just because you went through a training in September and you'll be able to understand, you know, that you do have them and how much they interfere with you becoming who you truly want to be and the values that you truly hold, they will eventually come back. So we have to make sure that we understand that it's something that has to be gained, but it's also something that has to be maintained. And I think that's the best way to put it. So they define the boundaries we're unwilling to expand. We're not going to go there. We're not going to go there because we don't understand it. We're not going to go there because we are lacking historical knowledge or perspective. We're not going to go there because we feel uncomfortable. So we've got to make sure that we're checking those at the door, and we're making sure that they're not getting in the way with our true values. So implicit bias is not deliberately hiding your prejudice. And take a look at what the next couple of lines say. 85% of all Americans consider themselves to be unprejudiced, yet researchers find that almost the majority of the people have some type of unconscious racial bias, an implicit racial bias. So people are saying things, but they're also thinking things. That goes back to that second screen when you're talking about the prejudice, the stereotypes, and the discrimination. People are thinking it, but sometimes they're not acting on it. And we can see that in today's society. Just all of the protests and all the unrest that's happened just in the past few years, it indicates that there is some type of bias out there. So we want to make sure that we understand that and understand that fully. When I talk about culture, it's kind of interesting. And if we had your mics on, and we will talk about this after, you would probably say 3 or 4 things when you talk about culture: food, language, maybe some history, and maybe another identity, the simpler aspects. But it's our environment that makes up our culture. It's our background that makes up our culture. It's how we're born and raised in the neighborhoods that make up our culture. So we need to understand that we are a vastly different society when it comes to culture. And just basic concepts of culture, not the ones that really drive us, because I think our true values, our mores, our values, our understanding, our family structure, I think we share all of those things as well. Very oftentimes, we don't talk about the things that we share from a cultural perspective. We always talk about the things that are different from a cultural perspective. In order for us to have humility, we have to understand our own culture and where we're actually coming from. At the end of this slideshow, I'll give you an exercise that you can do by yourself to have a better understanding of what your identity is. And there's another way of doing it, and I'll explain that as well. It's a little scarier doing it that second way. So I'll explain that towards the end of the presentation. But we want to make sure that we understand what's going on here. So cultural competency refers to the knowledge, skills, and awareness in cultural differences and similarities within and among groups. We want to make sure that we're competent so that those groups are actually going to do the things that we talked about earlier, the respect and dignity that they deserve. So you have really, when it comes down to it, 2 aspects of responsibility. You've got a one-word responsibility. You have a responsibility to treat people with respect and dignity. You have a responsibility to build relationships with people that are different than yourselves. And the other side, you've got a 2-word, a responsibility. You have to have the ability to respond to people that are different than yourselves. And that's putting yourself in situations where you might be a little uncomfortable, but you have to be able to understand that. You've got to be able to respond in an appropriate way to groups that are different than yourselves. You know, we always talk about the concept of triggers. And sometimes triggers are things that are setting people off that we're not even aware of, that we're unconscious of, and it allows the discussion to go in a different direction that you don't want it to go into. We have to be conscious of those things and conscious of the language and conscious of the triggers that we might be, expressing towards other people. So that's part of being culturally competent. The competence for some people is problematic, because when I say I'm culturally competent, I think most people say that there's an endpoint, that I've got it, that I understand it. And culture is dynamic. How many of you have traveled around the United States? And I've worked at 4 universities in 4 different parts of the country, and people are different. Just their lifestyles are different. So when I say I'm competent with a dynamic aspect of culture, I don't think I ever can reach that point. I don't think I ever can reach the point where I understand all of the cultures. Just take a look at Virginia Tech, 30,000 students. How many cultures are at Virginia Tech? There's no way I could become an expert in every single one of those cultures. And you have to understand certain things, because certain things are really important to specific cultures, but you don't have to understand that completely. To be quite honest with you, you could know limited aspects of people's culture and still have excellent and outstanding relationships with the people that are different than yourselves, because it's about that individual. It's about them getting to know you and you getting to know them. So sometimes it becomes problematic because some people look at it as a top-down approach. Cultural competence is not something we achieve or fail. I talked about that. We have to make sure that we're combining it with what you see in the middle of your screen, cultural humility. It provides you with the tools that you need to really be able to understand the changing dynamics of our country. Just think of the demographics of the United States over the past 10, 15 years. They changed drastically, probably faster than they did the 30 years before that. I just saw a statistic, excuse me, I just saw a statistic last week, I believe it was, that white American students in K through 12 are no longer the majority in K through 12. They make up 49.3%. So the other 51% are students of color. And that number is growing every single year. So this becomes extremely important. And then if you break it down to the number of people that have a 4-year college degree, you're looking at probably 28, 29% of our population. And most people think it's higher, and it's not. So you're looking at a group of people that have the opportunity to become leaders, and have to understand what their leadership actually means as well. And that means getting along with everybody and treating everybody with the dignity that they deserve. That's why this competency and this humility is so important. This is the absolute best definition I've ever seen of cultural effectiveness. And just read that very first line. To be culturally effective doesn't mean you're an authority in the values and beliefs in every culture. That's an impossibility. So it comes down to 4 things. A couple of them we've already talked about. Number 1 is the respect. I think number 2 is really important. It's your willingness to learn from people that are different than yourselves. And sometimes we're not open and we're not willing to learn. Very oftentimes in our society, we do more debating than we do dialoguing. We just try to prove that the other person's wrong instead of trying to understand where they're coming from. But you've got to be willing to listen, and you've got to be willing to learn from everybody. People are just like yourself, you can learn from. People that are different than yourself, you can learn from. People that are younger, you can learn from. Especially the younger generation coming up is very different than the generation just 2 generations ago. So your eagerness to learn is really important. I came home from a presentation one day, and my son Kyle, they turned 27 yesterday. I've got twin boys. When he was about 17, I came home from a presentation and he said, "Dad, how did it go?" I said, "Oh, I blew him out of the water. It was fantastic." And he looked at me and he said, "Do you realize that overconfidence is the alcohol of the fool?" I think I learned something that day. So you can learn from anybody if you're open enough to learn from them. The other thing that you have to understand is you have to be willing to accept. And when I say accept, many people automatically, once again, jump to culture. Are there aspects of other cultures out there that you can't accept? And the simple answer is yes. Sometimes it's how they treat women, sometimes it's how they treat the elderly, female circumcision. There's a whole list of those. So when I'm talking about accept, I'm talking about accepting the individual. You have to accept the individual, not all of the culture. You don't have to do that. Sometimes you want to embrace parts of their culture and some parts of the culture that you disagree with. They disagree with aspects of our culture. It's just no normal aspect of that idea. We have to be willing to accept them as individuals. And lastly, your worldview is not the only worldview. And I'm not just talking about internationally, I'm also talking about domestically. So we need to embrace those 4 concepts to be truly culturally effective. I think most people know what this is. I won't spend a lot of time on it. I think the old generation would say that we wear different hats, that we have different identities. This new generation might call it code switching, but we've got a lot of identities out there. I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, I'm a husband, I'm an educator. We go through those identities on a regular basis, and the person in front of us also goes through those identities on a regular basis. I was going around in class, it was business class. I think there was about 50 students in it last semester. And I was asking them what their primary identity was. And some people said Black, and some people said Latino, and some people said, Italian. But a lot of people said, I'm a military. They were the Corps cadets, and that was their primary identity. Some people said religion. That was their primary identity. Some person said that they were an aunt, and that was their primary identity. And that's how she actually looked at herself. So we never really know. So that's why we can't guess. We can't make assumptions about individuals because it varies. When I used to ask people where they were in terms of their cultural competency, I used to get these really vague answers. So I'd ask Ashley, "Where are you at, Ashley?" She said, "Well, I'm there. I'm almost there. I'm working on it. There's certain things I don't know," which really told me nothing and told them nothing. So I put this chart together so that people could at least identify where they're at in terms of their cultural effectiveness, and more important, where they're at in terms of leveraging what they've actually learned. So if you look at the first 3, the non-awareness, awareness, and acceptance, those don't require any actions. Those are just the knowledge that you're beginning to understand. The knowledge that you're understanding that difference is not deviant. The knowledge that you understand that we're not really involved in ethnocentrism, that one culture is better than the other, because the United States is made up of every single culture. I mean, every single culture that's ever come here has contributed something. And I'm a historian. I taught for 23 years, and I know that's a very true statement. But then when you look at the last 3, understanding, cultural adaptation, and intercultural skillfulness, those require action. And I think most people on this call are familiar with the concept that you want to step outside your comfort zone. And we talk about that all the time. I was part of a group at Colorado State, the President's Commission on Minority Student something or other, he called it. And President Yates is probably the most intimidating, intelligent man I've ever met. And when he said something, you tried to really impress the man. So we had 50 students in the room, and he said, "I'm going to go around the room, and I want all of you to tell me how you're going to step outside your comfort zone." He gets to the international student, and she looks at him and she says this, "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." I thought the room was going to implode. I mean, people were like, "How do you talk to Dr. Yates like that?" And he looked at her and he said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Why would I want to step outside my comfort zone? Because at the end of the day, I'm going to step back inside. Why wouldn't I want to expand my comfort zone that I can get to know the people around me?" And Dr. Yates said, "That's a brilliant idea." And I said, "Oh man, I'm next." So I had nothing to say. But it's really about that. It's expanding that so you're comfortable around anyone, whether you know their culture or not, because that's the whole purpose of being there, is to get to know them. So there's a variety of different ways you can move. You can go to readings, you can go to cultural events. And when I say go to cultural events, it's important to see the culture, but I think what's more important is that you're actually physically there. Your presence makes a difference. Any student that has ever studied abroad comes back a different student. Any student has ever put themselves in situations that they become the minority or situations that they haven't been in before where they can learn from, that's a real learning opportunity for folks. So just the mere presence of it being there at a cultural event is great, but your physical presence is great as well, especially if you're an educator. Because I have students, and when I go to these events, come up to me all the time on campus. Oh, I saw you at such and such. I didn't think you liked that kind of music. Well, I really didn't, but I thought I should show up. But you got to be able to put yourself out there. Probably one of the greatest ways you can do this is just bringing somebody to coffee. Just have coffee, lunch with some of your colleagues that are different so you can get to know them and they can get to know you. The way that I used to do it when I was teaching, I would send students to other cultures' institutional structures. You cannot have a culture in this society without an institutional structure. Most of them are churches, but a lot of them not. Christiansburg Institute, for example, is an institutional structure in the community for African Americans. There's all kinds of different institutional structures. But when you go there, people embrace you and you learn from them. When I was lecturing at the University of Kansas in a journalism class, a student had to go out into the community, in the community it was not her identity, and actually observe and then report on that. So a white student came up to me after class one day and said, could you tell me where I could learn about the Black community? Natural inclination is to send her to the Black church. Always has been and always will be the institutional structure in the Black community. But I sent her somewhere else. She came back and she raved that she knew everything about Black people in Lawrence, Kansas. She said they talked about politics and sports and their kids and religion and everything else. Anybody take a wild guess where I sent this woman? I sent her to the barbershop. If you've never been to a Black barbershop, then you don't understand what I'm talking about. And then at the end of it, she said, do you realize that people go there for 3 or 4 hours and don't even get their hair cut? And I just sat there and laughed, but she learned so much by going there. And she told them while she was there, she explained to them that it was part of her class. They talked to her, she talked to them, and now she felt extremely comfortable. As a matter of fact, there is an organization in California called Magic Links. And that's where she got her job. And they do a startup. I'm actually doing consulting work from them. She contacted me recently and I hadn't seen her in 6 years. So it's, these things stay with people and you've got to make sure that you're part of that. Now, we're going to talk about cultural humility. I'm going to skip this one. This is kind of a negative reaction to cultural humility and what Danzo is saying, that it's already built into cultural competency. But if you take a look at what it says in blue, and this is a direct quote from him, the need to question one's assumptions, beliefs, and biases. I think that's true for competency. I think that's true for humility. But what this doesn't say is you have to be able to identify yourself. You've got to be able to say what's important to you. You've got to be able to say how you identify as an individual, whether you're talking about your personal identity or whether you're talking about your social identity. You've got to be able to quantify that. And cultural competency doesn't call for you to do that. So a few words about humility. As I said, it was coined in '98. It came from social work and it came from the healthcare professions. I think the most important aspect on that screen is the whole idea that it's self-reflection and lifelong learning. You've got to understand yourself, and I'll give you some examples in just a moment, but it's self-reflection and lifelong learning that allows you to move beyond talking about the other, beyond talking about external aspects of being competent and talking more about internal aspects of being competent. Another way of putting it is that you know yourself better than anybody knows you. So you've got to be able to understand that, and some people don't. So it's lifelong commitment to self-evaluation, to critiquing, developing mutually beneficial and non-paternalistic partnerships, to make sure that the partnerships are even, that there's no power structure there. It's just based on the idea that you're building a relationship, and it may be a professional relationship or a personal relationship, but you're being open. And that's what I think people are talking about when they talk about you being genuine. When you're genuine, you truly have to know who you are, and you have to know how you identify. Culture shouldn't be limited to race and ethnicity. Isn't that what we always talk about? If we have a conversation about culture and I didn't throw out any topics, we would probably talk about race, ethnicity, gender, and religion, and leave out all other aspects of culture. In this society now, and where I'm living now, there's a really difference between being rural and urban. And those are definite cultures and definite identities of students that are actually on campus. I'm now part of the Master Gardeners Task Force to try and diversify the Master Gardener program, because they realize that. And they realize that they've got urban sections, but they're not even reaching out to that population. So there's other ways of identifying as well. And this is usually what we do. But look at all the other identities that we're missing. All the other identities could be people's primary identity. How many people do you know that their sexual orientation is their primary identity, that their parenthood, that their military experience, that their work background, especially, in this society, how do we identify ourselves when we meet somebody new? Reach out, shake their hand, and tell them what we do for a living. Many people, that is their primary identity, but sometimes we forget that, and sometimes we don't understand that. Even geographic location. I'm from New York. I have been in New York since I was 24 years old. So I left 40 years ago, but I'm still a New Yorker. Okay. And some people don't understand that. And that's always been part of that identity. So we need to make sure that, in other words, when we talk about DEI, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we need to make sure that the inclusion is not just the inclusion of the individual, it's the inclusion of all of their identities so that it's acceptable. On college campuses, they talk about safe zone and safe spaces all the time. My perspective is that every single space should be safe. Students should have the ability to identify and be their genuine self, because the more space we create for those identities, the more identities will emerge from those spaces, because they understand that they're not going to be judged and we're not going to make assumptions about that. So this gives you an idea of a real clear way of defining these two concepts. Whether you're talking about goals, values, shortcomings, or strengths, you can talk about competency. To me, if you look in the middle value, when you talk about values, that's knowledge and that's training. It enforces the idea that you can become competent in a culture. It supports the concept that cultures are monolithic. We lump people together all the time, don't we? We talk about Latinos. And if you've lived around the country, you know that there's a difference between Puerto Rican, Cuban, and Mexican, but they're all Latino. And it doesn't make any sense. Difference not only in terms of aspects of their culture, but also difference in terms of the attainment of their education, their household income, their jobs, their stratification. I mean, it's different, but we lump them together and we think they're monolithic. So when we say we're competent in Latino culture, what does that mean? Or even when we say we're competent in Asian culture, there's a difference between Chinese, Japanese, and Vietnamese and Cambodians. And we think that we can lump them all together and say that we're competent. That's part of the issue with becoming culturally competent. And if you understand that, then you have the nuances to actually be able to work through it, because it is still important to have a degree of competency. But then look at humility. It's introspection, it's co-learning, it's lifelong learning with no goal in mind. It's the appreciation of the journey, it's the quest. It's you trying to understand yourself as you're trying to understand others. So it's ongoing, and it's ongoing personal reflection. So we need to make sure that we're doing these type of things. 3 things to know. We move between cultures. We'll talk about reflexivity and competency in a second. And I think the third one is really important. Very oftentimes, we in this society are ahistoric. We don't understand the history of other groups. Sometimes we don't even understand the history of our own country. Just think of your own education. And think of if you ever made this statement: I hate my history class. I don't want to go to my history class. As a history professor, that really hurts me, but a lot of people don't like history. And if you don't understand people's history, then how can you understand how their situation is actually manifesting itself today? So we need to make sure that we're doing those things. So the first one is we're moving between cultures. And we talked about that. And we're moving between cultures. As it says on the bottom of that, you can't begin to understand the makeup and context of another person's life without being aware and reflective of your own background and your own situation. You've got to understand yourself. You absolutely have to. Reflexivity, simple way of saying this one, you're walking in somebody else's shoes. And you can't truly walk in somebody else's shoes. I know that expression has been around for a long time. You can understand them to a certain point. You can understand their experiences to a certain point. Has anybody ever heard of the book Black Like Me? It came out in the mid-1960s. And it was a white man who shaved his head, took some chemicals to darken his skin, and then he actually walked through the South as a Black man in the 1960s. And it changed his whole attitude towards race. It's a fantastic book. It was just reprinted a couple years ago, but it's called Black Like Me. And he experienced things he never ever thought he could experience before. That's what reflexivity is, to the extent, to the ultimate extent of doing something like that. And then the very last one is becoming aware of historical awareness. So I got both of my shots just before I got on the plane, which was a little scary, thinking, okay, I got a shot, I got on the plane, what's going to happen now? Well, I got both of my shots before I left. But if you're aware and you've been watching the news, there is a significantly high proportion of African Americans who will not get their shot, even though they have access to it. And it's not even if they want the Moderna, they don't want the Pfizer, they don't want any shot. Anybody tell me why? Why isn't Latinos? Why isn't it, Muslims? Why isn't it whites? Why is it blacks that are afraid and hesitant to get their shot? Laura?
Because of the Tuskegee
Yeah.
Experiment.
Yep,
Yes.
two things. The Tuskegee Experiment that most African Americans know in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they rounded up some black men in Alabama who had syphilis. They had penicillin to cure it, but they wouldn't because they wanted to study the effects on the body and the brain. Anybody ever hear of Henrietta Lacks? If you have never heard of her, Google her, Henrietta Lacks. If you take a look at the majority of the cures that have happened since the 1950s for cancers, it came from her cell. Her cells are really unique and really unusual, and they multiply and they last for a long time. And I'm not a scientist, so I don't know how to explain it in more detail than that, but they were the basis of the founding of many cures for many diseases and many illnesses and many cancers since the 1950s. They didn't tell her they took her cells. They used her cells. She got no money for it. They had to sue the company for it. They denied it. There's a really good movie that Oprah Winfrey put out about that as well. Put those two things together and you have a better understanding of why Black people might be hesitant to get the shot. So that's why I think cultural history is really important. You've got to understand where people are coming from, the hesitancy of what they're doing. And people think it's history and it's not. It's also the contemporary issues. So I'll say that's all I want to say about that, but this is a really important piece that people have to understand. So challenge each other. You've got to challenge each other in situations and challenge each other, once again, with respect, because sometimes I know it's difficult to have those conversations, but you've got to be able to understand where people are coming from as well. You also have to be able to ask questions, because if you're asking questions, then you're learning. I think it was the Dalai Lama that said, when we're talking, we're not learning, but when we're listening, we're learning much. So we want to make sure that we're listening to people as well by asking them questions and challenging people in a respectful way. And you're an expert on your experience. We're all experts on our own experiences and the experiences and unique challenges that we've had. And we want to make sure that we understand that. We want to make sure that we can use our experiences to make a better world, but we're not experts on other people's experiences. We simply are not. And I know people want to be, and people want to tell people how to think, and people want to tell people how to react, but you can't. You can't tell people how to react. You can't tell people how to think. I've always told people in any presentation I've given, my job is not to change your mind. My job has never been, in 32 years, as an educator, to change your mind. My job is to give you the information so that you can decide for yourself. Some people are going to say this is important and I need to make sure that I use it and embrace it. And some people are going to say, I don't really need that. I treat everybody the same. And that's a really interesting concept. Anybody have more than one child? I have 4 children. I have twin boys that are 27, a 29-year-old, a 32-year-old, and 3 grandchildren. And I treat them with respect, but I cannot treat them the same. If I want to treat them equal, that means I can't treat them the same. It means I need to treat them different. And what I mean by that is they need different things. I've got twin boys that one of them is extremely mature, probably the most mature kid I've ever met, and the other one's extremely immature. And he knows I say that about him, but he's trying now. He's working on it and he's getting there, but I treat them equally by treating them differently. So we need to make sure that we understand that, and that's what I talk about, but you're not an expert on other people's experiences. Tell them how they should feel or perceive their own experiences the wrong way minimizes their humanness, and then it shuts down the conversation. These are exercises. I'm going to explain 2 ways to do these. One is a really easy way, and it's all your information to yourself. So we're going to say Laura is going to fill out her personal identity wheel. She's going to fill out everything on the outside of the wheel so that she understands what she really enjoys and what she really is part of and what her life slogan is and so forth. And then she's going to fill out the middle of the wheel. Then, more challenging, she's going to fill out her own social identity. Fill out the outside of the wheel and how you identify, which is interesting because some people don't know how they identify. For example, if I were to say race and ethnicity, could somebody tell me the difference between those 2 terms? A lot of people can't. And when you talk about race, race is basically Black, white, Asian, Latino, and Native. And that's how the government, that's how the universities have to fill it out. But the interesting part about it is that the federal government also says one of those 5 groups is not a race. Black, white, Latino, Native American, Asian American. The government says that if you are Hispanic, Latino, Mexican, Chicano, that you're white. You're Caucasian. Ever see the form where it says white, Hispanic, white, non-Hispanic? That's exactly what they're talking about. So their Hispanic aspect is their ethnicity. They can be Cuban or Puerto Rican or Argentinian or Mexican, whatever it is, but that's how the government actually defined those terms. So sometimes people don't even understand the language, so they're talking about different things at the same time. One's talking about apples and one's talking about oranges. So once again, Laura will fill out this and then she'll fill out the individual ones. Now, if you really want to be challenged, and this is the way I do it with students, and once you do this with students, they will not stop talking at the end of the exercise. And I've never had any student be offended by this. Some of them are really nervous and scared, but then once they get into it, they enjoy it. So I'm going to match up Ashley and Laura. And Ashley's going to fill out her personal identity wheel. Laura's going to fill out her personal identity wheel. They're going to turn the page over without saying a word to each other. Nothing, no questions, nothing at all. Ashley's going to fill out Laura's social identity, and Laura's going to fill out Ashley's social identity. What do you think happens at the end of that exercise? Which I think is important to understand cultural humility. Very oftentimes, you think there is an image that you're portraying, but that's not the image people are seeing. And students find that out. And it's really interesting when they find it out. Oh, you thought I was this, or you thought I was that. Even professionals. I did this with a group of elementary teachers in Colorado Springs not too long ago. So this woman was working with somebody else that she didn't know. She knew her from work, but that's about all. And her name was Martinez. She gets down to religion and spirituality. What does she put down for Miss Martinez? That she's Catholic. Her name is Martinez. Miss Martinez was Jewish, and it took her 5 minutes to convince her colleagues she was Jewish. They kept going back and forth going, but your name is Martinez. She said, but I'm Jewish. But your name is, and we all stopped and listened to it. And then at the end of the conversation, the woman says this: it's okay if you're Jewish. Like she was giving her permission. But sometimes we make these assumptions that we just hold on to forever. And we make them all the time because one thing that's important, you've got to allow people to identify who they are for themselves. You know, I've had a lot of people make assumptions about my identity, that I'm African-American, that I'm Puerto Rican, that I'm Mexican. Some people said I'm from the Middle East, but nobody allowed me to actually identify myself. My grandmother's name is Santina Angelina Vigliotti. It doesn't get any more Italian than that, believe me, okay? But I've got to convince people of that. But this is a good exercise for folks to actually take a look at it and say, okay, maybe the image I'm putting out is not the image that people are seeing of me. And it really allows you to do so. The very last thing, and then I'll have any questions that you have, we always forget about this piece. We absolutely have to give grace. Because if we do not give grace, we will not get grace. We will not be allowed to make mistakes. And if we're not allowing the people that we're talking to make the mistakes and to move on from the conversation, then they're going to shut down and they will never have that conversation again. You've got to be able to give grace and recognize that it doesn't matter how long you've been doing this, doesn't matter how much you think you know, doesn't matter how culturally effective you think you are, you're going to make mistakes. You're always going to make mistakes, and we have to give grace and we have to get grace. I was the announcer for graduation at Colorado State for 10 years. I've been working with this Muslim woman for the longest time. It had to be 7 or 8 years trying to get her to graduate. She'd drop in and drop out, and drop in and drop out. And then eventually she'd walking across the stage. I didn't even see her. She hands me her card. I recognized her name. I dropped the card because I was so happy she was graduating. I gave her this big, huge bear hug. Anybody know what I did wrong? You do not touch Muslim women unless you are in their family. And her parents from Saudi Arabia were sitting in that front row, and I could just feel the daggers coming down from the stands, to be quite honest with you. She stepped back and she looked at me and she said, "No problem, Blaine." And she walked across the stage. Because I had been giving her respect, I'd been treating her with dignity. She understood it. She knew I made a mistake. She gave me grace and she moved on. I guarantee you, if it was somebody she didn't know, that would have been a huge scene at graduation. So you've got to make sure that you're giving people grace and the grace that they deserve. Not just the grace that they need, but the grace that they deserve. So I'll end the presentation there and just open it up and see what you all have to say. The sun's starting to come up here in Reno now.
I thought that was excellent. Anybody have any questions or comments?
And like I said, humility has been around, at least the concept and the theory has been around since '98, but a lot of people don't talk about it. We're so focused on one aspect, and we're kind of a zero-sum society. that if we give something and we take something, we're losing something and all those kind of things. But we can do both of those at the same time and put both of those in place, because then we actually become better people, and not just our interaction with others, but even ourselves, understanding ourselves internally.
I just wanted to thank you for sharing cultural humility. That was new to me, and it helps give a language, a phrase to talk to people that otherwise might not be comfortable talking about these kinds of things. And so I appreciate having that.
Yeah, and it allows you to have a better understanding as well. And I think that's part of it as well. And the most important thing is, and I didn't say this, is that you don't change who you are. And that's part of the problem, is that people change who they are because they think that they've got a cultural being standing in front of them, which I think is just so foolish, and it's so obvious that they're not being genuine. I'll just give you a real quick story if it's okay. So my daughter, when she was 16, 17, 18 years old, she traveled with this group of parents. And these girls were all on the same team, but I was the only Black parent there. So a white parent who wanted to make me feel comfortable, I knew he wasn't doing this because he didn't like me, because we got along great. At the beginning of the games, he'd go down the line and shake the parents' hands. Get to one parent, oh, daughter has a good game. He'd get to me and he'd do this funky handshake. He'd pound his chest and he'd say, right on. And he wasn't joking. I mean, he was being serious because he thought he was relating to me and making me feel comfortable. And for the longest time, I didn't say anything to him. I just pounded my chest and said, right on. Just because I didn't quite know what else to say to him. I didn't want to make him feel foolish because I knew he wasn't trying to be mean or anything. He was trying to make me feel comfortable. And then eventually a parent that knew me pulled him aside and said, that's not Blaine. Blaine doesn't do that, okay? You've mistaken what you're actually doing, thinking that you're culturally competent. So we've got to make sure that we're just genuine and we are who we are. Don't change who you are. Don't try to be too cool. Don't try to, be too young. None of those things work because none of those things are genuine. You can be who you are and be just as culturally humility and cultural competent as anybody else in the world. Other questions?
If others aren't going to say something, I wanted to just share that we didn't talk about politics a lot, because I know that wasn't necessarily the goal here and the thing at the kind of top of the peak, but it's in my community, which is as around the country, that feels like one of the hardest things right now, because the moment you say anything, you get put into this box as if you're all these other things, and it just feels really hard.
Oh yeah, and it's gotten worse. I think we've become politically divided more so now than I can even remember any time during my generation. Even during the 60s, people were on the same page for certain aspects of society. Now we're just either on the left or the right, and that's it. And you're absolutely right. If you say something wrong, and it's probably the worst thing you can be called in this society is a racist, but if you say something wrong, and you say something that people just don't disagree with, all of a sudden you're labeled as a racist. And it might not be true. It might just be a difference in political ideology, a difference in strategies, whatever it is, but people will label you really quickly these days, real quickly. We've gotten to the point where we're not listening very much. Patricia?
So I don't even know how to formulate the question, but several of us on this call are involved in trying to figure out how to make our organization more responsive to needs of the community in different kinds of contexts, different kinds of communities too, not just race and gender, but
right.
Other ways. And I'm not struggling here to formulate a question around that, but it's difficult for us, mostly as white folks, trying to figure out how to even begin to find those groups to be able to do the listening.
Yep.
Can you make any comments about that? And I'd love to hear from some of the others as well, as how your organizations have made sure that your organization is as responsive as possible to the needs in our broad NRV community, because that's what many of us are trying to do.
Yep. I'm not a master gardener. I just like gardening, but I'm on the Master Gardeners Task Force now statewide. There's 25 of us, and we meet every Saturday morning for a couple of hours because they're trying to diversify their constituents. They're trying to diversify the people that get into the program, especially considering Master Gardeners isn't very diverse to begin with. So they asked me the same question. How do we identify? How do we understand? What do we do? Number one, it has to come from the community. You can't identify the issues and problems that the community faces without talking
Right.
to members of the community and giving them voice. And the second thing, and a couple of the folks have already done this with the Master Gardeners program, I told them to go to church on Sunday. Go to somebody else's church and talk to the pastor so that you can actually get in front of them, because that's where everybody's gathered. And if you talk about diversity in terms of this country, I hate to say this, but Sunday is the most segregated day of the week. People go to churches with people that look like themselves. And if you can get in front of them there with the agreement of the pastor, especially in certain ethnic communities, Latino communities, Black communities, even Asian American communities, because they already have the credibility and the trust and respect of the community members, and they're allowing you to speak and actually introduce your programs, it works really, really well. And that's just one example of an institutional structure that you have to involve from the community. And many communities have other community centers, community involvement, boys and girls clubs, whatever they happen to be, that they can also get involved and have them be part of the recruiting base, so you're not doing all the recruiting yourself.
Yeah.
Once they understand it, you're putting some of the onus on them to make sure that the word gets around. But it works really well. People always forget about those institutional structures, and they always go to individuals because that's what we're used to doing. Even politics, you go to individuals to, use your ability to persuade them, but the community listens to those structures because those structures support them.
Yeah. And then that's where they gather too. So
that's exactly it. You've got a confined audience. You don't have to go around and figure out where they're at. That's where they are. Yep. Mm-hmm. And there's differences, in religious structures, there's differences in community structures, and you just have to be able to get into those structures. Perfect example. And when I said this to a few people around here, and they said, "Oh, there are no African-American structures." I said, "What about the Urban League? What about the NAACP? What about the Christiansburg Institute?" I start and they go, "Oh, okay." Because the only thing they were thinking about were churches. It's the only thing they were thinking about.
Well, I think we know about some of those because they're part of our lifeblood at the Community Foundation.
That's right.
But I feel we feel less secure, less informed about where the Hispanic communities are, which are growing in the New River Valley,
right.
And not historic. They're growing in recent times, or international communities. We know about international students, of course, at the university, but there are international communities here that are non-students. So
they're oftentimes hidden.
Yeah,
you don't even realize it.
But they have their own effective networks. I'm quite aware of the Indian community here has a very effective personalized network. When something goes wrong in an Indian family, they are all together, but figuring out how to serve those communities if there are needs there that we ought to be involved with. That's where we're at right now, trying to figure out what those are and is there a relationship that we ought to have.
Yep. That's one of the first things I did when I got to University of Nevada. There's 3 major tribes there, and I just knew one of my staff members that had an inn and introduced me to all the elders. So I had a direct line to the elders in the tribe, which made a huge, huge difference in whether or not anybody listened to me. So it worked out really well. You just have to know what the right people to contact, I think, and just have a way to actually contact them, which sometimes is difficult. That inn is really important.
Share what we're doing. Oh, sorry.
I
was just going to say, it'd be interesting to hear from some of the other nonprofits on this call if they've been successful in doing those kinds of entrees into other groups. I'd love to hear from some of the rest of you if you found ways to hear, listen, that kind of stuff.
I can share what we're doing at community. I'm Kim Strong, work at Community Housing Partners, and we're doing a lot of different things, but one I wanted to touch on is, so we're a large organization with staff across 6 different states, about 375 staff. And one effort that we're trying to make is to institutionalize equity within CHP. And so, our first step was really we have an equity inclusion team, and we've been around for about 6 years now, working on different aspects of equity and inclusion. But we recently created an equity statement for the organization and have it now as part of our strategic plan. And our next major step, actually in 2 weeks, we're having, we created an equity lens, which is a series of questions that you can ask about the work that we're doing and who it's impacting, who it's not impacting, who's being left out. And we're rolling that out to about 50 leaders across the organization. And we're actually, and by we, I mean the equity team. And we're asking them to at least once a quarter, take a look at one of their programs, policies, or practices and assess it through that equity lens, the series of questions that they ask, and really, and then they're submitting their responses to those questions to the equity team. We're going to be reviewing them and providing guidance back to our leaders around how they can adjust or change, or even like get rid of some of their policies and practices that might not be having the equitable impacts that they think they might be having. So this is brand new. We haven't rolled it out yet, but certainly happy to share as we get into that process.
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful to see your questions and how they might be adapted by other organizations.
Sure.
I'd like to just add our experience. I'm Sue Farrar with the Montgomery Museum, and we are partnered with Christiansburg Institute and have been working for maybe 3 or 4 years in partnership. Our experience it's very personal, it's very deep, and it's very intense. We went into the partnership thinking this is how we would all be working, and we hit some bumps, some really big bumps, and had to put our relationships aside for a year. And we're back on track now, and we have gone to the depths to talk together and share and just expose ourselves to each other to have this understanding and to begin to learn about each other and to listen and to hear. It's been a real journey. I'm an 81-year-old Southern white woman, and I come from that because that's how I was raised and how I came. And I'm in a deep friendship with a 30-year-old Black Hispanic young man, Chris Sanchez, who I'm sorry is not on this program this morning. And our friendship is amazing. And we have great joy in acknowledging it. And it's making our progress work well together to perform a project. We have a wonderful project going on. But the journey has been extremely interesting and very emotional and very rewarding at this time. And I also want to say, Blaine, I really thank you for bringing this today. It's been amazing. But we have a garden at the museum managed by master gardeners. And I love the fact that you're involved in trying to bring diversity there, and would love to see that happen here. So I hope you'll come visit us.
Oh yeah, most definitely. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's funny, I'm the only person on the Master Gardener Task Force that's not a Master Gardener. So I told them what they need to pay me is knowledge so that I have better tomatoes next year. But what I want to say as well, just before I lose this thought, is I'm really happy that the groups that are now talking about equity, they weren't talking about equity before. You know, everybody knows what DEI is now. I mean, it's really taken off because everybody before was talking about equality. And there's no way you can have equality until you have equity first. And people don't understand that. So they need to, I'm just so happy that we're using that terminology now because it's important. Equity is fairness. I think one of my colleagues said, equality is giving everybody a pair of shoes, as equity is giving everybody a pair of shoes that fit. So. Other questions anybody has?
This is Vicki Culpepper, and I am with Girl Scouts of Virginia Skyline. And we're actually working on a new patch for the area that is a patch program for girls about inclusive excellence. We've partnered with the state of Virginia in their DEIJ program and Dr. Underwood to facilitate this, to make it go further. And because we're noticing that if we can basically instruct not only ourselves and teach ourselves at our age as adults, but catch the girls younger, then and basically make it more of their lifestyle at the youngest age possible. So that, I guess, is where we're trying to go with this, if that makes sense. It's early. I haven't had enough coffee.
Makes
But-
perfect sense.
Yeah, that's, I mean, because we're finding that I'm the grant writer, and what happens is even within our own organization, when I first started, I noticed inequities actually between how we treated what was formerly called outreach troops, and we changed that to community troops because I did not personally like the label that it gave to girls and anybody who would apply for financial assistance. It bothered me intensely. And fortunately, the entire council has taken that same approach too. So, but is that the trend? I mean, I guess other organizations that we work with in the NRB, are we finding that if we can get it to the kids first, and then as we teach ourselves so they can see us fail basically and learn that and know that we're learning with them, is that helpful progress? Or I'm just looking for feedback actually. Does that make sense?
I think it makes perfect sense because what you're doing is you're empowering people that probably never have had any power before, so that they have a voice, so that they can make decisions, so they can be involved in the process when they've probably never been asked to be involved at that level before. So I think it's telling them something about themselves as well.
Yeah, the majority of the girls that I reach out with and work with just for feedback surveys and their responses on our programs are right around the 3rd to 5th grade age level. And I think they're the ones that have the strongest voice because they get it, they see it, they're living it, but they can't put a label on it quite yet.
Yep. And you hope that it continues
Right.
into the time they're in middle school and junior high and high school and so forth. And that's part of that socialization, I think.
Yep. All right. Thank you.
So in addition to my involvement with the Community Foundation, the other hat I wear is around with lifelong learning. So Vicky's question where she's working with young people, I'm working with older people. So our lifelong learning group is all 70 years and up. And we've done a lot of learning, Blaine. So what we're trying to do every term that we offer something is to learn some of this history that none of us ever learned.
Yep.
And although our group is not very diverse, I think it's our mission to try to self-educate ourselves. And so I just wanted to reiterate one of your slides. It's a lifelong journey, and we feel utterly appalled at what we don't know at our age, what we did not learn in high school, and what we learned that was so wrong.
Yeah.
And so, I'm at the opposite end, Vicki. I'm working with older folks trying to rediscover some of this history and understand how that history impacts what's going on today.
And as an African-American historian that taught that for 23 years at Colorado State, students came up to me all the time. And it wasn't just Black students, it was Black students, white students, Latino students saying, I'm really upset, and I'm asking them why. And they all said the same thing. How come I'm just finding out about this?
Yeah,
How come I'm 20 years old and I'm just finding out about this? So it's that history that we're not really taught. And in terms of the group you're working with, Patricia, I think that's fantastic because there's a lot of stories that older people have that have never put down in print that people need to hear, and everybody needs to hear those stories. And you're giving them the opportunity to tell those stories. Even though you say they're not diverse, I'm sure they have a wealth of diverse experiences that they actually can be talking about.
and they do like to talk.
Well, it's sometimes when you get to that age, it might be the first time anybody's ever asked you about your story, because we don't ask that question on a regular basis. We sometimes advertise individual stories and then we latch onto those, and then we forget about everybody else. But everybody wants to tell their story. It's important.
Well, I think this was a really great training. So we really appreciate you and your time, Blaine.
My pleasure.
Got a lot out of this. We did record this. So if there was anybody that couldn't make the call that you guys want to share this with, that will be posted to our website later. So just know that as well. Our next nonprofit listening session is going to be on May 20th, and it's going to be all about submitting grants to the Community Foundation and some tips and tricks there. So be on the lookout for that as well. But once again, Blaine, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Waking up at 4:30 to join us. So we really appreciate you being here. This was very informative.
Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And by the way, my email is real simple. It's blaineharding@vt.edu. If there's anything I can do for anybody, don't hesitate to reach out. anything whatsoever.
Thank you.
I'll enjoy going back
Thank
to
you so
bed.
much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.